It is the morning of January 28, 1986. You're standing at Launch Complex 39B at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and the air is just bitterly, unusually cold. A towering marvel of human engineering, the Space Shuttle Challenger is venting vapor into the freezing sky, waiting to carry 7 Americans into orbit. But beneath the frost, and well beneath the intense media spotlight, a catastrophic failure has already been set in motion. The temperature is 36 degrees Fahrenheit at liftoff, and overnight, the temperature had actually plunged as low as 8 degrees. For a massive spacecraft designed to slip the surly bonds of Earth, this kind of extreme cold isn't just uncomfortable. It is a lethal, totally unmapped territory, and it has silently compromised the very joints holding the shuttle's massive solid rocket boosters together. The stage for tragedy is completely set.
At exactly 11:38 a.m., Challenger roars clear of the launch pad. But this flight, it lasts only 73 seconds. Almost immediately at ignition, a puff of smoke appears at the right rocket booster's field joint. Now, a temporary seal of solid fuel briefly plugs that gap, which actually allows the launch to proceed. But at 36 seconds, Challenger hits the most severe wind shear ever recorded during a shuttle launch. That violent shaking dislodges the temporary seal. By 58 seconds, a concentrated, flamethrower-like plume of exhaust is visibly escaping the booster, blowing directly onto the shuttle's external fuel tank. At 73.1 seconds, that external tank fails. The structural backbone of the entire vehicle is compromised, and overwhelming aerodynamic forces just tear the orbiter apart. Inside the crew cabin, the realization of this violent breakup is instantaneous. The final recorded words from the cockpit, spoken by pilot Michael Smith, right as the vehicle begins to disintegrate, are simply, "Uh-oh." And the really chilling part? Evidence later showed that the forces experienced inside the cabin were not immediately fatal. Several emergency air packs were actually manually activated as the intact crew compartment began its free fall down to the Atlantic Ocean. We absolutely have to pause here to honor the 7 pioneers who lost their lives that day. Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, along with payload specialist Gregory Jarvis. And of course, Krista McAuliffe. She was a high school teacher from New Hampshire, the very first civilian chosen to go to space to teach lessons from orbit. Their loss completely devastated a nation that was watching it happen live on television. Section 1. The ignored warnings and a fatal decision. Because as the smoke cleared and the investigation started, a chilling truth emerged. The destruction of Challenger was not some unavoidable freak accident. It was the direct result of a known engineering flaw. Let's rewind the clock a bit to see how the warnings were completely ignored. Before Challenger, the absolute lowest temperature for any shuttle launch had been 53 degrees Fahrenheit, which happened a year earlier. The engineers who built those solid rocket boosters knew exactly how their hardware behaved at 53 degrees. But 36 degrees? That was a totally dangerous unknown. It was a no man's land, as one engineer called it. Okay, so let's dive into the actual mechanical anatomy of this failure. The solid rocket boosters are built in massive segments, and those segments are sealed together by these rubber rings called O-rings. Their job is absolutely vital. They must instantly expand to form an airtight barrier, stopping the intensely hot combustion gases from getting out. But extreme cold does something terrible to rubber. It hardens it. It completely robs the rubber of its flexibility. A rigid O-ring simply cannot expand to seal the gap. The night before the launch, there was this frantic, desperate meeting. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, that's the company that made the boosters, they explicitly warned NASA about these O-rings. Roger Boisjoli, a mechanical engineer who had actually sent a memo 6 months prior warning of a catastrophe involving the loss of human life, practically pleaded with management. The engineers issued a formal recommendation: do not launch below 53 degrees. But NASA executives pushed back hard. Under intense production pressures and facing all these weather delays, Morton Thiokol's own senior management overruled their engineers and gave NASA the green light anyway. Section 2. The Ice Water Test. Enter Richard Feynman. Following the disaster, President Reagan formed the Rogers Commission to investigate the whole thing. And it was this brilliant, highly unconventional, Nobel Prize-winning physicist who cut straight through all the bureaucratic misdirection. Feynman essentially bypassed thousands of pages of dense reports with one devastatingly simple, nationally televised experiment. He was actually tipped off by astronaut Sally Ride about some cold weather O-ring data. So, Feynman took a piece of the exact O-ring rubber, clamped it in a small C-clamp to simulate the pressure of the rocket, and just dropped it right into a glass of 32-degree ice water sitting there on his desk. When he took it out a little later and removed the clamp, the rubber just stayed flat. It didn't bounce back at all. Feynman leaned right into his microphone and delivered this completely unassailable conclusion. At 32 degrees, there is zero resilience in the material. The frozen O-rings on the Challenger could not expand to fill the gap. That lethal blow-by of hot gas was entirely inevitable. The hardware didn't fail because of some dark mystery. It failed because the laws of physics literally do not bend to NASA's launch schedules. And this brilliantly, tragically illustrates the massive disconnect Feynman exposed between NASA's engineers and its executives. See, in previous flights, O-rings had actually sustained damage, burning a third of the way through. Unbelievably, NASA managers recorded this as a safety factor of 3, mistakenly assuming that because it only burned 1/3, they had a 2/3 cushion. Feynman was just incredulous. He pointed out that, look, if a bridge is designed to hold 3,000 pounds, but a 1,000-pound truck causes a beam to crack, your safety factor isn't 3, it's 0. The part is actively failing. NASA executives had a startling, fundamental misunderstanding of elementary engineering concepts. Section 3. Normalized deviance and a cultural failure. To truly wrap our heads around Challenger, we have to pivot away from the mechanical failure and look at the deeply ingrained cultural failures. Years later, Columbia sociologist Diane Vaughan looked past the rubber and the ice to apply a sociological lens to the whole disaster. So this brings us to a crucial concept in this explainer, the normalization of deviance. This is the insidious process where deviations from safety rules become completely acceptable within a workplace culture simply because the organization keeps experiencing success despite those flaws. NASA didn't have moral evil managers wanting to risk astronauts' lives. No, they had a broken system that mistook lucky survival for a safe vehicle. Here is exactly how this builds into a deadly cycle. First, an anomaly occurs, like an O-ring getting severely scorched on a launch. But the flight survives, and the astronauts come home safely. Because the shuttle returned in one piece, the managers subconsciously decide the risk is acceptable. They use a little putty to fix it, essentially creating a new, lowered safety standard. Over time, an urgent, screaming threat subtly morphs into a routine, acceptable risk. As Diane Vaughan so brilliantly put it, mistakes of this magnitude are socially organized and systematically produced. The actual structure of NASA's management permitted internal flight safety problems to completely bypass the key shuttle managers. The engineers on the ground, they had the data, they knew the danger, but the communication structures were so flawed that the people making the ultimate, final launch decisions were operating on completely incomplete and misleading information. Section 4. A culture grounded, the aftermath and redesign. The fallout from this was just monumental. The entire Space Shuttle program was grounded for 32 months. NASA was forced into a top-to-bottom redesign of the boosters and had to fundamentally restructure its internal safety culture. Meanwhile, Morton Thiokol forfeited a $10 million fee. Richard Feynman even threatened to remove his own name from the official report unless his harsh, unvarnished criticisms of management were explicitly included. The Challenger disaster is an incredibly stark reminder that physics just does not care about our schedules, our extreme pressures, or our past luck. Accepting small, recurring risks simply because nothing bad has happened yet is a guaranteed recipe for catastrophe. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on today. Where might you be normalizing deviance in your own systems, your own organization, or even your own life?